backup just in case, I don't remember everything.
Yeah.
So is it just like research papers that you normally read, or is it also like novels or, like fiction? Like, do you have to read those types of texts?
That kind of depends on what you're doing. And so the research is the most important stuff in order to keep your job. And so to be current and know what's being discussed in there, you do need to do that. For instance, I read other stuff too because I like to read, and so I like to read fiction and history books and figure stuff out about that. For me, I find ways of using that also in my teaching, and so I can, in order to make a course like this, for instance, I have to go, I get books like Books in the Victorians and other history books or novels, like we had the whole thing with Kafka and Ovid's Metamorphoses, where I've taught courses about those.
Yeah, I read that in high school.
And so I do like to read fiction also and see how does it actually play. And, our movie activities in some ways also, it's not reading per se, but it's reading about the movies and figuring out how is that part of our conversation.
Yeah.
So for the job itself, it's more the technical stuff. You can incorporate the other ones. I also find something which I wanted to highlight is a lot of entomologists are trying to also figure out how to broaden their stuff to more people. And so popular science writing and blogging and figuring out how to help people relate this to the world when they're not entomologists is becoming more and more important. And for that reason, it's also useful to not just read only technical journals. And if you can actually talk with someone about a book that they've read, then that helps them understand you better.
That makes sense. So I guess that kind of leads into how do you address or answer research questions in your field? Is it purely research? I actually don't really know any types of research that entomologists do, so I can't give an example.
Yeah. How about to answer that question and maybe answer kind of show you how to answer those questions, how to do this stuff. I'll show you two of the papers we've written in the last couple of years.
Okay.
And so this is a evolutionary biology paper where we found a new species and we described it and describe how it's related to other species. And so to do this kind of research, what I had to do was we define specimens, looking at lots of specimens, see some that look different from the other things, then go and compare them to the other stuff that we know and the other ones that it possibly could be. Take the fly, we dissected the fly, here's the genitalia, where I go and dissect the genitalia and look at those parts so you can compare how those shapes are different. I wrote to some Russian researchers to get pictures of the things that were most closely related to it, so that way we could actually compare our species to their species in the same genus. And then write it up. And so you have to write up, sometimes really tedious, you're just talking about the head. The cuticle is black, the tementum of the face is silver, the vertex and occiput have gray, tementum, all these different colors. You're describing shapes, how many hairs and bristles, and measuring different parts of the body. And so you write up these species descriptions. DNA is a big part of entomological research today too now, and so also for this one I sequenced 4 genes from their DNA and estimated how it's related to other species that way. And so we've got various related species in that group here, and then figuring out who is sister to whom using computer programs, and then put in here's where's our new species, and so it came in here. I did field work, so here I'm comparing. Oh yeah, these are the 2 sites where I collected the species. I had to go out, you know, the only thing we knew, we'd found 3 specimens in an old museum from the 70s when the Nevada test site where they blow up the atomic bombs. They were trying to do an ecological, what is here before we blow it up. And I found some of these weird flies, and so I needed to get some more samples, and so I had to go look at maps and find what's a spot just outside the test site so I don't get arrested by the military police.
And you also don't get radiation.
And I don't get radiation, and where it's decent habitat that looks suitable. And so I went out there and camped and caught some flies and then brought them back to the lab. And it was really cool.
That sounds really cool.
That all went into writing this paper. The other thing I went into the paper as an example of reading was this genus was previously only known from Central Asia. And so all the other literature about it was all Russian, because Kazakhstan and Central Asia was where those species were described from. And so I had to read these Russian papers in order to then be able to relate and compare them to what we've got here. All that went into making just one paper that honestly nobody has cited still after a year and a half. But it's out there, and if anyone is trying to study species of robber flies in Nevada or Central Asia, then they will need to know the species because it's out there, and it's part of what we know is out there now. One of the depressing things about robber fly research is there aren't that many people, and so there's not that much that happens on a day-to-day basis with it. But so, you know, I still work with papers from the 1800s sometimes because that's the most recent time someone's actually worked on a group. As a result, though, I know also that my paper, in some ways, is going to probably be useful for a couple hundred years, where someone down the line who's trying to study robber flies will need to read this to find out. So I did that one. Here's one I did with an undergrad student, and actually my father, who was another professor, where this was a student wanted to do research with us, and so we helped them write up a grant so they could get some money to do a summer research program, stay with a month, and do some field work. So this was fun because we wanted to actually find out more about the biology. The 2 main types of research I do are their evolutionary history of who are the species and how are they related, but I'm also really interested in how do they live, and we don't know very much about that. And so we went out, and up in upstate New York, found this river site near Lake Placid, and we got permission from the landowners there to go sample the flies down their river. And then we went and we marked hundreds of flies with paint dots of different colors. And then the student went out, there were 2 girls who went out every day or 2 with binoculars to mark flies and track them for a whole season to find out how many flies were there during the season from June to July.
Every single day. Well, it doesn't look like every single day, but did they do it every single day?
They didn't do it every single day, because if it was really rainy, the flies all went to hide. So here's actually one of the data tables of the days that they were actually sampling, how many flies at each one of these different beaches. So here's the different beaches down this thing. So we were tracking spatially where they were too, and so then we could see how far were they moving. I guess there's various charts and stuff for how big of a home range were individuals having. We could track were individuals mating with other individuals multiple times, who was mating with whom, were there other predators around. So these 2 girls, they spent 2 months out looking at flies with binoculars, tracking how far they're moving, writing down where each one went. And then we had to, integrate it in. And so there hasn't been very much mark recapture work done with robber flies. So one of the things I was able to contribute for this project was I summarized these are all the other papers, the research projects that have been done with mark recapture of robber fly species. What do we know about how long do they live, and age of individuals, how long the whole season of when they emerge is. summarize that. And so then we could actually compare, how does this species, how is it similar or different to some of these other species? What are things that we learn about it? What was stuff like the lifespan. Altogether, the species, you can find them on those beaches for about 50 days or so. But the longest any individual lived was about 3 weeks. And so by actually tracking individuals, we could see, okay, well, they're living up to 3 weeks, which is more than a day or two, we often think. But also means they're not lasting the whole season. So there must be multiple waves coming out to populate this area. So anyway, we had to write this up. We just got this was coming out this week, this journal, to write up this description. This project happened in 2015. So it took years for, after she did the project, then for her senior project, she wrote up, did the first pass of analyses and writing it up as a report. And then my father and I both then worked on editing it and tying it into the other literature and improving some of the analyses and getting it into a more professional voice.
Yeah.
And turning it into a paper. And so now, she's the first author on this paper, and we've got finally done 4 years later. And this summer, actually, before I moved out here, I had 2 other students who were doing a similar project with a different species. And so now this winter, we want to try to get a little faster and write up a paper to analyze similar stuff for that species, and then we can compare it to this one. So I bring these up both partly as examples of how do we, to do these, we had to find there was a deficit in what we knew. We know for this genus, no one has ever marked them before. Nobody knew how long they lived or how far they flew or anything like that. And so okay, well, we could find this out. Let's come up with a way to do that. One of the things you find reading this paper is there has been a lot more work done on dragonflies. And so we were able to learn a lot of techniques from reading papers written about dragonflies, of how you mark and watch and what are issues to think about with marking insects and tracking them. And so in this paper, we're also relating to the dragonfly literature because that's where we had to learn a lot of these techniques from. And so then we could design a project that would answer specific questions of how long do they live, how far do they fly, who mates with whom, and then write it up. So that's an example of an ecology style paper.
Yeah, that makes sense. Gosh, it's a lot that goes into it. Okay.
It's a lot of what?
It said there's a lot that goes into it.
There's a lot that goes into it.
Yes, especially 4 years worth. Okay, so how did college prepare you for writing in your field? Like, what classes were particularly relevant or useful?
That one, I struggled to think of which classes were the most useful.
I mean, you don't have to answer that. That's not really, like, a part of, but it's just kind of like for my own kind of...
So, to be honest, the only English class I took in college was my senior year. I had to, in order to graduate, I had to take a technical writing course. And I put it off and didn't take it until my senior year. And it was really easy, and actually for the main project on it, I was writing up a manuscript for a paper we were publishing, and I just used that. And my professor was like, well, if you're getting them published already, then that's it. So my English class at college wasn't really that useful. I took AP English classes in high school that were useful in terms of forcing me to learn to revise and make better sentences and better paragraphs that made more sense. And then there were some of my upper level science courses like ecology and evolution that we actually had writing assignments where we had to write some papers and do that. But to be honest, I didn't write a ton in college. I think the longest paper I had to write in college was only like 5 pages long. And then I went from there straight to PhD, and my dissertation ended up being 160 pages long. And so it's such a big jump And so I had to work really learning on writing and revising and writing and revising. And so I'd meet with my advisors, every week or two, give them a new draft. Because actually what was the main thing that was often in early grad school and in late college that I was often doing was proposals for grants. And so grant writing is kind of the third main type of writing. You get the peer-reviewed academic papers, you get the public outreach blog stuff, and then reports or grant proposals are kind of the main other type of writing you do. You need to get money to do research.
Yeah.
And so figuring out how to take my idea and compile it into just, a 2-page proposal, because that's as much as they're going to read. How do you make these paragraphs pop and make them explain what you need to explain and not lose the reader?
Yeah.
Those drafts were what really, I think, also helped improve my writing a lot of those. So then eventually I could step it up and write 15-page, 20-page, 100-page papers after that.
Wow. I know that, like, research scientific articles, like, have a specific way that they're written, like with the abstract and the, all the jargon.
Yeah.
So did you learn that from, like, on the job, or did somebody, like, teach you? Because apparently you didn't, like, take a class for it.
Yeah. I would say, so a lot of it I learned through reading. And so
Oh, okay.
I wrote, kind of, how did you learn those? Read a lot. I've read thousands and thousands of articles about my flies. And so reading what other people have written has helped teach me, okay, what are the conventions that I need to know? And then finding some trusted mentors that I could take my writing to, share it with them, and they would give me feedback on this needs to be strengthened, this is good, rearrange this part. Having trusted people that I could take drafts to, between reading and then lots of revising, was how I learned a lot of that stuff.
Okay.
Yeah, I never really had a class that did IMRAD's Introduction, Methods, Results,
Interesting.
Discussion
That's
as
interesting.
much.
Gosh, this one's a long one. What's the work environment in your field like? I work outside.
So it's
like,
a lot of outside. There's also a lot of inside too. I mean, I spend a lot of time at a microscope, and whenever I go outside catching bugs all day, then I have to come home and I have to spend 2 hours pinning insects and writing labels for them so that way they don't get lost. Then there's a lot of computer work, running analyses on your computers, reading and revising papers, and responding to emails and stuff like that. So those are all part of the daily life in there.
Okay, so how did you communicate with your colleagues and peers? Like with the writing both of these, obviously you worked with other people, like how did you talk to them?
Yeah.
How did you kind of collaborate to make this paper?
Mostly email. What I found, what I do the most is most of the communication happens with email. Every now and then go and actually visit. You can talk to them in person and do drafts with each other or look at specimens together or actually discuss stuff. And so for both of these with my co-authors, I wrote this with a guy up in British Columbia, and so I've gone out to visit him 3 or 4 times now over the last 6 years, where I'll go fly there, spend a week working with him, we'll work on preparing something, and then we'll email back and forth for months after that. So with this, we do emails, and then send a draft, and then we call them up and spend an hour going over the draft with them on the phone.
Okay.
I like some in person, but also a lot of stuff you can do remotely and work at your own speed. One of the nice things about the job is a lot of it you can do. It's fairly flexible to your life. It's not really a 9-to-5 job. It's more when you have
time
and energy, you can focus that on there.
Yeah. Okay. So how are the tasks distributed? Because I know this one, you worked with an undergrad, so she primarily did most of it, and you kind of like were the backup, I'm guessing. That's how it sounded like. But what about, you know, the other one that you're working with, the guy in British Columbia?
So, how do we distribute tests? That's a good question. A lot of it, I would say a lot of the academic stuff that I'm involved with runs on a model of mentor and mentee in some ways. And so, you know, in this one, we had an undergrad and she wanted to go into science. And so we'd meet with her and advise her to help her come up with a project, train her, have her go and actually do a lot of the field work, and then come back and then we could help her process it. And so we were there to help teach her and have her actually do a lot of this stuff so she gets in the boots on the ground experience. But then we can be there to help it be better. This one kind of for me was the other way around, where he is one of my mentors, and so, you know, this is a nice 70-year-old man who has spent his life working with flies, and basically, you know, he's the one who actually found the cool specimens. And so he'd, over 50 years of looking at specimens, he'd noticed these were different and cool, and so he's like, well, maybe you should look at these and compare them and compare something about them. And so he kind of gave me recommendations on this would be a useful thing to look into.
Yeah.
He made specimens available for me to look at. Then I'd write up a draft and send it to him, and he'd give me feedback on it. So this one was with my mentor, this one I was being a mentor in part. That's how a lot of how do we split it up? In part because everyone's busy, and so usually unless you have to do the work, you don't want to do the work, and you try and find someone else to do the work for you. But it's part of, you know, learning to be an adult too, is taking those responsibilities and saying, I can do that, and then if you do that, okay, you can be a co-author then if you do the work. Does that make sense?
Yeah, makes sense. So with that, how can you make an impact in your field?
So there are lots of different ways. I'm trying to think of how broadly to answer. Writing papers that people will use is a major way of doing an impact. Getting specimens and preparing specimens, that way people down, 10, 100 years from now would use those specimens is useful. Getting some outreach, so that way people fund museums and keep a department of entomology going in the university, so that way the university doesn't defund this. That's useful too. The actual flies I work with aren't that important for day-to-day human life as far as we can tell, and so I don't really feel like I'm making an impact necessarily in how your life or my life goes.
Yeah.
Other than we're trying to better understand this planet around us, we're trying to understand how do all these species live, and if we can better understand that, then I think we can better figure out how to live sustainably without wrecking the environment, and how to coexist and promote diversity in useful ways. I think that's one of the useful things from learning about robber flies, and flies in general. Flies are, as we've talked about in class, they're really important, but they're often overlooked.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I don't know if I had any in there that like you wanted to go over, because the next couple of questions are just kind of like my own personal questions rather than for my English paper.
A couple of just briefly, you asked how often are you writing? I write every week, usually every 2 or 3 days. I'm working on revising or writing paragraphs for some paper and signing them off. So I write every day, every other day. The main type of sources, primary literature is the main thing, and so it depends what type of research you do, but for many entomologists, they're just going to be primary literature for everything. How is your writing in your field different from writing in other contexts? One frustrating thing that we see in college is, and that we've struggled with in this class already, is everybody does citation slightly differently.
Mm-hmm.
Every field is different in that regard. Ours is different too. Part of it is just you have to learn what is the proper way for the field where you're working in. A lot of entomologists aren't great writers. So a lot of the text, the sentences aren't, I mean, a lot of them don't have to be that great. They're not, if you're describing what a fly looks like, you don't want to use poetic language necessarily, because you want to be precise about this is what the fly actually looks like, so that somebody else can replicate that. And so if you're using precise technical language and not prose that makes your heart sing. I like writing prose too, and so, you know, it's nice to try to find some places maybe in your introduction or your conclusion where you can actually write sentences that have better structure and relate to other ideas in other ways. And so, depending on how strong of a writer you are, you can still probably make things work. There are lots of successful entomologists who are terrible writers. It helps to be better at writing because you don't have to revise as much, and going through review process is easier because it's not as, doesn't use much triage. But this isn't an English PhD, right?
Yeah.
I'm guessing these are some of your own questions. How did you narrow down what you want to do? Okay, so we can get to those later.
Okay. So I wanted to ask, like, what's graduate school like in an entomology program?
Oh, that was a good one. I actually didn't do an entomology program.
Oh.
I was in an ecology and evolutionary biology program. My graduate school didn't even have an entomology program. It is similar to what entomology programs are like. Just the focus was more broad. Entomology specific programs are much, you take lots of classes about physiology of insects and lots of pest control and applications to entomology, so you can learn those ways. With mine, you don't take very many classes for any of these. A lot of the hard science PhDs, you know, I took 4 classes maybe, spread out over the first couple of years. Most of your work is spent working on your research.
Okay.
And so for masters, it's usually more class driven. You only have 2 or 3 years, and so you take classes and then you do a small research project and write that up, and you're done. For a PhD, usually your first 2 years you're what's called a pre-candidate, and then you actually take a couple classes. So I took a class, you know, on molecular evolution, took a class on population ecology. You take a couple classes to broaden your knowledge and get more training and stuff.
Yeah.
And then, you know, 3 years or so of working on your research project and writing those results up. One of the other nice things, which I should plug, even though I also want to be very cautious about plugging people to go into this, is you don't go into as much debt as a lot of graduate programs. And so, you know, for most PhD programs like this, you're teaching as like a graduate assistant, TA, or something. You get some teaching experience. That's part of how they pay you. And so as a result, you don't get into debt to pay your stuff. They usually pay your tuition. They pay you $20,000, which, you know, is poverty wages, but it's different than med schools or law schools where you're getting, at the end of it, you'll be $200,000 in debt.
For sure.
Now, they make more money
In the end.
at the end.
If you even make it through med school.
Yeah.
If you even make it to your resident med school. Med school's hard.
But their whole system is designed, they put you in debt because they know within 10 years you'll pay that off and you'll be making a lot of money. Our model's different where they don't put us in debt, but we never make that much money. But we get to do it, for us at least, we like to do. I get to go hiking and look at flies all day long. I like that. I would be much happier doing that than being a lawyer or
Mm-hmm.
being a doctor. So graduate school in that sense is very different than a lot of humanities or business type graduate work.
Mm-hmm.
I think those are the most important things to bring up about that.
Okay. Yeah. On the TA thing, it makes sense that they do that. The reason why I ask it so early, because I'm only like first semester freshman.
Yeah.
But because I graduated with so many things in high school, I could actually finish my degree in 4 semesters, and then I'm allowed to use my scholarship to go to graduate school. So I'm just kind of seeing, I don't know a lot about graduate school, so that's kind of why I ask. And I know you're part of the entomology program, but I know that you're also new, so I wouldn't be like, how is,
Yeah.
U of A's program? 'Cause,
I shouldn't talk about that yet because I don't know if to actually give an honest
yeah.
sense there. There aren't very many entomology specific programs in the country. I mean,
Yeah.
I know of about half a dozen, maybe 10 schools that actually have entomology programs. UA is one of them. We actually have master's and PhD students for entomology here.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess part of what my story tells you is also you don't necessarily need to do it in entomology itself as long as you're in a
Yeah.
related field.
Yeah. My major's in molecular and cellular biology, so I could technically go into that and then also do entomology.
Yeah.
Hmm.
I mean, I didn't necessarily know I wanted to do bugs. And so you mentioned had you narrowed down what you like to do. I never thought I was going to be an entomologist. I was in 4 different labs in college trying to experiment. I started out in a plant lab where I did plant systematics. Then I did a field ecology one where we're out measuring how rainfall affects plants growing and grazing. I worked with mammals where we were radio collaring martins and fishers and tracking how mammals are running around in the forest.
That's cool.
And I didn't join an entomology lab until I think it was my sophomore